Welcome to Bunny Trails, a whimsical adventure of idioms and other turns of phrase. I'm Shauna Harrison.
And I'm Dan Pugh. Each week, we take an idiom or other turn of phrase and try to tell the story from its entry into the English language to how it's used today. Have you ever seen your coworker or neighbor do something you like and then you find yourself wanting to do it too? Or maybe have that same thing? That kind of behavior is wrapped up in a phrase that we use in America called keeping up with the Joneses. Now, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, to keep up with the Joneses means, quote, to strive not to be outdone by one's neighbors, to emulate one's neighbors, end quote.
I'm excited for this one because I have no idea where this phrase came from, and
I
never
didn't
even
know.
thought about it coming from somewhere, to be honest.
Yeah, well, it turns out there is a very specific place this came from, so we will get to that. But before that, I want to look at the two primary components of this phrase. So, to keep up with, right? So we're keeping up with the Joneses, but what does to keep up with mean? So keep up in this sense has been used in the intransitive verb, and the Oxford English Dictionary defines it as, quote, to continue alongside, to keep abreast, to proceed at an equal pace, end quote. So if you are running a race and you're trying to keep up with the person in front of you, to keep at an equal pace, that makes sense, right? This use of keep up with has been used in this way since the early 1600s.
Okay.
So keeping up with someone, proceeding at an equal pace, this makes good sense for this use in the phrase. Throughout our life, we are trying to keep up with others around us, what we see in movies or series or social media, all of which shape our ideas of what we should be doing, what we should have, and when we should do or have that thing. The next question then is, why the proverbial Jones family? Now, this is one that's a little more difficult to pin down, but we do know the name Jones has been a stand-in for a general family since the late 1800s. Here's an example from an 1879, and this is in the work Memoirs of a Station Master by E.J. Simmons. And I'm taking this quote by way of the New York Times. In it, Simmons was writing about the social aspects of a railway station. Quote, the Joneses, who don't associate with the Robinsons, meet there, end quote. So this was just a general, there's this type of family, they don't associate with that type of family.
Okay.
Here's an example from Mark Twain, and this was written in a short poem in 1910, though it wasn't published until after his death. Quote, the outside influences are always pouring in upon us, and we are always obeying their orders and accepting their verdicts. The Smiths like the new play. The Joneses go to see it, and they copy the Smith verdict. Morals, religion, politics get their following from surrounding influences and atmospheres, almost entirely not from study, not from thinking, end quote.
Wow.
Yeah, that was like super. Yeah, good job, Mark Twain. Wow. I mean,
are we surprised?
Well, it's just that his work is oftentimes satirical. His work is he's a humorist and he's parodying things and joking about things. So, we don't always. A lot of his quotes are taken in that context. So it's rare that we get to see something that was serious.
Right.
And that's part of the reason why he never published this. This was published after his death after the phrase became a thing. So we'll get to that with the phrase.
Okay.
But in these examples, we see the Joneses, the Smiths, and the Robinsons all used as generic others who are stand-ins for the average everyday family. So why do we predominantly use the Jones family now? Well, this appears to have originated as a phrase in 1913 with a comic strip published in the newspapers of the day called Keeping Up with the Joneses. This strip was written by Arthur Momond, who published under and went by the name Pop. In the strip, the main characters are the McGinnis family, and in the strip they are constantly trying to match the lifestyle of their neighbors, the Jones family. I don't believe the Jones family ever appears in the comic strip. They are an unseen force, but their whole 25-year run of this comic strip in newspapers is basically the McGinnis family trying to keep up with the lifestyle of this unseen Jones family.
Okay.
So here's a quick paragraph about Pop Momond from Lambic Comiclopedia. Quote, Arthur R. Momond was an early American newspaper comic artist. He was born in San Diego and attended the Trinity School in New York City. In 1907, he began his career as a sketch artist for the New York World, owned by Joseph Pulitzer. He also created several series for that paper. In 1913, he created the strip Keeping Up with the Joneses, a title that would go down in history as a phrase meaning trying to keep up with the standards of your acquaintances. Momond drew his parody of American domestic life for about 150 daily newspapers in the United States and Canada from 13 March 1913 until 16 April 1938, and always signed it Pop, end quote.
Okay, that is so cool. I had no idea that there was like a specific place that this came from.
Yeah. Obviously, Keeping Up with People had been used since the 1600s. The Joneses had been used, along with the Smiths and other families, as generic names for families since the late 1800s. So we definitely have these things in place, right? But it wasn't until the popularity of this comic strip that the phrase Keeping Up with the Joneses was cemented into a household name.
Just imagine, we could have been keeping up with the Robinsons.
Well, we'll get to that in just a minute.
Okay.
So Pop was born in 1887 and he died in 1987. So despite the acumen or lack thereof I sometimes show on this podcast, I do know how to math. So I know it is perfectly reasonable for a person to live 100 years, but my brain still struggles with someone being born in 1887 and dying in a year that I remember quite well.
It also, what 100 years to be alive. I'm sure like every century has its share of changes, but I mean, dude,
Right.
Tron was out in 1987 and this dude
Star
only,
Wars, yeah. I
like,
mean, like this
yeah.
is, yeah. You
And-
were
and this
you were born
dude
without
was born
without any sort of
into-
running water
yeah.
or plumbing, and yeah,
may or
and
may not have had electricity.
yeah,
and,
no,
like,
yeah,
a
exactly.
vehicle. I mean, to drive or whatever. I don't know.
Right.
That's
No, this. I mean,
bonkers.
it really. This is that would be a wild 100 years. I mean, we went from
And
horses to being on the moon.
and so many and like big wars. I mean, I don't know. People are constantly talking about feeling like the world's going to end, but this guy,
Wow. Yeah. No, that's a good point. And you know, everyone his age, but like 100 years. That's
Yeah.
that's a long time to live too. So
yeah,
especially
that's
for
true.
dying in 1987.
You're
so.
going to see a few things.
Right. It's interesting this phrase could have gone with a different name, as you kind of alluded to. Robert Hendrickson, in his work The Encyclopedia of Word and Phrase Origins, noted, quote, Momond first thought of calling the strip Keeping Up with the Smiths, but finally decided on Keeping Up with the Joneses as being more euphonious, end quote.
Okay.
Yeah, euphonious is a fancy way of saying it sounds better. So he decided Keeping Up with the Joneses sounded better than Keeping Up with the Smiths or Keeping Up with the Robinsons.
Yeah.
Which I think Keeping Up with the Joneses does sound better than Keeping Up with the Smiths, but I am biased from hearing the term for my whole life, so I'm not sure I'm a good judge.
Fair. I definitely like it. Got a good cadence to it.
Absolutely. Well, this comic strip, Keeping Up with the Joneses, was turned into books and movies during the comic's 25-year run, and that really helped spread the phrase to a broad American audience, as well as a Canadian audience. And of course, Canada's ties to England and the UK meant that it was spread there, as we'll see in some of these examples that we're going to use here in just a few moments. But it is very rare that we can find an actual origin point, an actual starting point for a phrase. So
Right.
it's really cool to be able to find this one and to see 1913 and the start of this comic strip as being the cultural zeitgeist that really started this phrase.
Yeah.
All right, let's look at a few ways the phrase was used outside of the context of this comic strip. And to show how far this influence spread in a short time, I'm going to start with this one in the Belfast newsletter out of Antrim, Northern Ireland. And it was dated 1 September 1924. This is from an article talking about how the cost of living in Ontario, Canada is more expensive than living in Ireland, but not necessarily because of the food cost. Quote, fruit is cheap and plentiful in Ontario, but vegetables seem more costly than in Ireland. I do not think that the food bill keeps up the cost of living in Canadian cities. Perhaps it is keeping up with the Joneses, end quote. which I think that's interesting. And this isn't the first time that we see the phrase, but I like this one because you start seeing it used in the newspapers in the 20s and beyond. And it's partially because of this. Well, I mean, it's entirely because of this comic strip. But the comic strip was in newspapers in Ontario and in Montreal. And so their ties back home, so to speak, being part of the United Kingdom and part of the monarchy, means that there was a good amount of conversation back and forth, and so this got to spread to the UK very quickly because of the popularity of the comic strip. Here's one from the Laclede County Republican out of Missouri, USA. This is dated January 1st, 1926. And it's from a piece called The Fault of Parents and focuses on a judge from the 34th Judicial Circuit of Missouri and his comments regarding juvenile crime. Quote, "Mother and father are so busy making money or trying to keep up with the Joneses that they haven't time to maintain a home for their children. They keep a mere hotel." End quote. Those
Wow.
are harsh words.
Yeah, what an interesting concept.
Yeah. Well, putting it in the context of my own experiences, I wonder if this is really what was happening, or does Judge Harris simply not realize that sometimes the reason mom and dad aren't home as often is because they are trying to keep the electricity on, and Judge Harris makes too much money to see how the rest of America lives. But I wasn't alive in 1926, so maybe I'm the one being too harsh. I don't know.
Hard to say.
Uh, Here's one from the Somerset Daily Herald. This is out of Pennsylvania, USA, dated September 13th, 1934. And it's a snippet from a work called The Joneses in Reverse. The article is a lamentation of the strain of the American people from the teaching of Christianity. And this one sentence, though, really captures how we use the phrase today. Quote, "It's all a matter of keeping up with the Joneses. For it is the Joneses who start the things with which the balance of us imagine we have to keep up with." End quote. They go on to really lambast the Joneses, these make-believe proverbial people, as a way, I assume, of lambasting everyone who doesn't fit and conform to their religious views. The authors, I should say. All right, this next one is from the Gazette out of Montreal, Canada, and it is dated January 3rd, 1941. It's from an article in which the author claims America has become too soft as a nation because it doesn't realize fitness, self-control, and power all go together. As with the previous quotes, I'll skip the historical figure yelling at clouds parts and get right to the point. Quote, "How many of us are wasting our moral energies in various and frustrated longing to keep up with the Joneses, to have a mink coat, to own the newest model car, to have a louder title, a fatter salary, a more important job than the next man." End quote.
Nice.
He said a 1941 car, but I've inserted the point into his thing. But yeah, so that was from 1941. And it occurs to me through the last several of these that the phrase is often used in an overly negative way throughout the years. And I don't know that it is always used that way now, but definitely many of the examples I found were negative. And the comic strip itself was a parody of how many people are trying to keep up with these proverbial Jones family, the others, you know?
Yeah.
So I do find that interesting. We'll look at one more here. This is from the Evening Star, and it is dated December 2nd, 1956, and it's out of Washington, D.C., USA. This one is more neutral than some of the articles we've used so far in the episode. Quote, "Been trying to keep up with the Joneses? Then you'll certainly want to meet the Joneses," by Claire Huffaker. Here's a peek into the lives of strange and wonderful couple, Mr. and Mrs. Average American. End quote.
Okay.
So that whole article is about what was the average American family in 1956. And it was fascinating, and we're going to look more at it in our behind the scenes video.
All right.
These release every Friday on Patreon, and they feature the video recording of the show, which is lightly edited, including a short section about our week before the show and a special bonus feature after the show, which this week is about the proverbial Joneses. Join us on patreon.com/bunnytrailspod to check out the behind the scenes video every Friday. And speaking of, it is time to say thank you to our sponsors, our patrons.
This episode is sponsored by our amazing patrons on Patreon. And the cool thing about Patreon is it is 100% free to join the community. We have new things every weekday on the feeds. On Mondays, we have a conversation about what movies, shows, books, podcasts, and whatever else everyone is enjoying. Tuesdays see early access to the week's podcast. Wednesdays have all the links, books, songs, and other content mentioned in the week's episode. Thursday has patrons-only polls, and Fridays are our lightly edited behind-the-scenes video featuring all the cut content, goofs, and bonus facts you could imagine.
We've got some other pretty cool stuff too, like original digital artwork once a month made by Shauna, and direct access to talk with us. No algorithms getting in the way of what we see or don't see. Plus, you can get awesome name recognition like Pat Rowe does every episode. And our top spot is currently occupied by the amazing Mary Halsig Lopez. You can join the Bunny Trails community for free at Bunny Trails Pod on Patreon.
That's patreon.com/bunnytrailspod.
All right, let's look now at some of our more modern uses. Keeping Up with the Joneses is a 1965 song sang by Farron Young and featuring Margie Singleton. It's a classic country and western style song, and here's the opening line. Quote, "Well, the Joneses bought a house. We did too. Then a new car, so we bought one too. 'Cause we had to keep up with the Joneses. It was the usual thing to do." End quote. This song devolves into the Joneses getting into legal trouble and breaking up, and the singers, not to be outdone, do the same thing.
Oh.
I can't tell if this song is supposed to be satire or not, mostly because the current American timeline no longer draws a distinction between what is absurd and what is real, and I'm just not sure how far back that goes. So I don't know if this was supposed to be like satirical or if this was just, I don't know, man, about a family who just did exactly that. I don't know. I don't know. I can't tell the difference anymore.
My goodness.
All right. In 1977, Waylon Jennings had a hit with the country song Lukenbach, Texas, Back to the Basics of Love. The entire song is about breaking away from a life keeping up with the Joneses and is mentioned in the second verse. Quote, "So baby, let's sell your diamond ring. Buy some boots and faded jeans and go away. This coat and tie is choking me. In your high society, you cry all day. We've been so busy keeping up with the Joneses, 4-car garage, and we're still building on. Maybe it's time we got back to the basics of love." End quote.
Aw.
Aw. Notorious outlaw country singer Waylon Jennings. Singing about something sweet. That's funny. All right. Keeping Up with the Joneses, Envy in American Consumer Society, 1890 to 1930, is a look into the changing view on envy in America. It's written by Susan J. Matt, and here's a synopsis from this 2002 book by the publisher, University of Pennsylvania Press. Quote, "A century ago, many Americans condemned envy as a destructive emotion and a sin. Today, few Americans expect criticism when they express envy, and some commentators maintain that the emotion drives the economy. This shift in attitude is Susan Matt's central concern. Keeping Up with the Joneses, Envy in American Consumer Society, 1890 to 1930, examines a key transition in the meaning of envy for the American middle class. Although people certainly have experienced envy throughout history, the expansion of the consumer economy at the turn of the 20th century dramatically reshaped the social role of emotion. Although people certainly have experienced envy throughout history, the expansion of the consumer economy at the turn of the 20th century dramatically reshaped the social role of the emotion. Matt looks at how different groups within the middle class, men in white-collar jobs, bourgeois women, farm families, and children responded to the transformation in social and cultural life." End quote.
Okay.
I bet this is fascinating for people who care about this sort of things, but I bet I would be very bored by this book.
Yeah, okay, listen, like some people think that I'm an anthropologist, not a sociologist. What I do think is interesting, what I thought about while you're reading this, is the fact that, like, I was thinking about commercials, and, like, a lot of our commercials, well, I haven't seen one in 20 years, but still, a lot of more recent commercials are very, like, somebody's driving a car, and they are, like, it's a positive that somebody's looking at that car and wanting that same car as somebody else,
Sure.
So that's kind of what popped into my mind while you were reading through that.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah. And then I think, was that not always the case in ads? They didn't have that competitive, like it wasn't okay to show
Well,
people being
you
competitive with
mentioned you
their
haven't seen a
buying.
commercial in 20 years, and I think what you mean by that is you haven't seen a commercial on a television in 20 years.
Yeah,
Because
that's
even
true.
even having whatever you have, Netflix, Hulu, or whatever, if you have the ad-free versions, you can't get on the internet without seeing commercials,
Uh,
advertisements.
they're
So
very true.
I think maybe that was a thing that came with like, looking at things like cars or big ticket items that maybe people didn't buy like that before.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I
Interesting.
don't know how much the horse-drawn plow cost or whatever, or bull-drawn, depending.
But
So I don't know.
I'm like, yeah, I guess that's the thing. It's like, when did that transition of like buying for needs sake versus to have or whatever, and
I don't know.
then to compare with other people? Interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. It reminds me like the concept of lawns. How like it was almost like a flex to others that you could have space of property that you owned that didn't have to be devoted to
The crops or something,
crops,
or
yeah, to
yeah.
keeping yourself alive. So
Uh,
yeah.
okay.
Anyway, that's a story for another time that I won't be telling. Okay, so keeping up with the Jonesin, spelled Jonesin, which is a slang term for relaxing, was released in 2006 and is sung by Jamie Johnson and features George Jones. It's pretty much what you'd expect from a country song in the mid 2000s. Quote, Lord, I quit the drinking, the smoking, and the honky tonk life the day that ring and a preacher made her my wife. Yeah, and I said I do, but I didn't have a clue I'd miss all the whiskey and women. I tried to be true, but it's all I can do, keeping up with the Jonesin. End quote.
Okay.
So in this case, it's a play on that keeping up with the Joneses, but he's trying to keep up with this more relaxed life rather than the hard living life. And it is really actually pretty telling to have George Jones on the album, being featured on the album, because the George Jones was known for living a hard life, doing a lot of those things that in the country world would have been considered like hard acts, the drinking, the smoking, and the general honky tonk life.
Yeah.
All right, Keeping Up with the Joneses is also a 2016 movie starring Zach Galifianakis and Isla Fisher as an average couple raising a family, and John Hamm and Gal Gadot as the new neighbors, the Joneses. Here's a synopsis from 20th Century Studios. Quote, An ordinary suburban couple finds it's not easy keeping up with the Joneses. They're impossibly gorgeous and ultra-sophisticated new neighbors, especially when they discover that Mr. and Mrs. Jones are covert operatives. End quote.
Fantastic. Because I was thinking that Gal Gadot and John Hamm would make a
Yeah,
Mr.
they
and
look like
Mrs.
a spy
Smith.
couple,
Yeah,
right?
like the Mr. and Mrs. Smith, that movie. That's
Exactly.
what I was thinking. I was like,
That's exactly where
yeah,
Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Yeah, it's that
I
the
love
generic
it.
people, right?
Yeah.
It's a generic name, but yeah.
But
So
they're
these
not generic people.
no, they're not generic people at all. Of course, we're going to link to the trailer for this movie in the show notes, which are available on our website, bunnytrailspod.com, as well as on Patreon. I did not see this movie. I'm a fan of Zach Galifianakis. Boy, his name is really hard to say. Zach Galifianakis's humor, and also, for better or worse, this is what people say about me, and they're like, "Who would play you in the story of your life?" Unfortunately, or fortunately for me, it is Zach Galifianakis.
That's
That is who
amazing.
people, when they say what movie star most looks like you, and then that's the one people come up with frequently. A lot of people, and I don't know how to take that. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously he's a very good-looking man, but
You're like, well, thanks for the
he has to be a
compliment.
good-looking man if he's going to play me, and yeah, he's got it. But
That's
now this
awesome.
is obviously it's a comedy, and I have not seen this movie, and I want to now. So I haven't,
It
if
sounds
I
like
haven't
a
watched a
fun
movie
movie.
not on a plane in a while, but I think this one might be one that I do.
You'd watch, yeah. Yeah, it sounds really fun.
Keeping Up with the Joneses is a book series by author N.S. Johnson. It is a spicy series of short works that appear to follow a Mrs. Jones. I won't be reading them as they are not my thing, but if you are curious as to the nature of them or what spicy maybe means, I'm going to read the first few titles. Book 1 is called Receiving the Delivery Guy's Package.
Oh.
Book 2 is called Giving the Coworker a Rise. And book 3 is called Hedging Mr. Jones's Trim.
Oh my My Lord. Okay, yeah, there's another word. I don't know what it is. That's not spicy, but something that's just like it's just very blatant. I feel like there's.
I believe the word you're looking for is pornography.
Yeah, that's what this sounds like. That's what this sounds like.
I don't know. Like I said,
Maybe
I
not. I
didn't
don't
read
know.
them. I know we have high schoolers that listen to this, but you and I are both parents of kids that have been high schoolers not that long ago, and I know that high schoolers are talking about this kind of stuff anyway. So I know school boards don't trust high school students to be humans, but we do not have that problem here on Bunny Trails. So if that's your kind of thing, I guess go for it. I am not. That's not my thing, so I'm not going to be reading them. But I
Use
think it gives.
discretion.
Yeah, I know this gives you plenty enough to recognize the kind of books that are in this book series. There are 15 of them,
Mm-hmm.
so reader beware. But there you go. Okay. There are many, many other uses of the phrase and allusions to it, but I don't have time to list them all. So I'm just going to give you three more rapid fire ones that you may have heard of. The first one is a 1969 hit song by The Temptations, Don't Let the Joneses Get You Down. So a lot of
Fantastic.
people may have heard of that. I don't want you to think it's just country songs that I listed before.
I was wondering.
Yeah, here's one that you didn't probably hear of, but I heard of it, but I didn't play it because we didn't have it. And this was a 1990 life simulation video game by Sierra Entertainment, and it was called Jones in the Fast Lane. And it was basically your job was to try and keep up with the people around you, keeping up with the Jones. So,
Okay.
so you're in the fast lane. And
Nice.
then here's another one that many people have heard of. Most people have probably heard of, whether you realize it was a play on this or not. The reality TV show Keeping Up with the Kardashians, which is a play on the phrase replacing Joneses with the Kardashian family name.
Yeah, in that context, I just assumed it was like keeping up with, as in knowing about the things they're doing, because it would be impossible, I think, for most people to do anything close to keeping up with them.
But that does not seem to stop people from trying.
Fair enough. Wow.
Well, I have never been one for keeping up with the Joneses where things are concerned. I'm a function over form kind of guy. Many people tell me that my stuff is ugly, but if it works, I don't care. I've also been made fun of before in the past for my gift giving, which has included things like smoke detectors, fire extinguishers, and step ladders, and
Very
or
practical.
flashlights and that kind of thing, where people use my gifts for years and years and years, but they are not happy to unpack them, despite the fact that they now have them. So that I have never been one for trying to keep up with the Joneses for stuff. When it comes to doing things, however,
Oh my.
I do like to spend my money on experiences rather than things. And sometimes someone tells me about something they've done, and I think that sounds really cool. So I also want to do it. I'm a planner and a penny pincher, so it often takes me years before I'm able to go on that trip or go see that type of show or go do that similar thing. So I don't know if I really try and keep up with the Joneses as much as I try to get ideas for cool things to do from the Joneses. But admittedly, that might be a distinction without much of a difference because I'm still going to try and go do it. So, where experiences are concerned, maybe I am a keep up with the Joneses kind of person, just not where a stuff is concerned. But I think maybe the caution isn't what we are keeping up with the Joneses about. It's more that maybe we should just be careful about who we decide the Joneses are to us. And that is about all we have time for today. If you have any thoughts on the show or pop culture references we should have included, reach out to us on Patreon, patreon.com/bunnytrailspod, or comment on our website, bunnytrailspod.com.
All right, it's poll time. This week we asked about shoes. What do you wear around the house? A full half of our patrons go barefooted at the house, with the rest of our patrons being split between just socks and some sort of house shoes, meaning a shoe or slipper that is only worn inside the home.
I was really curious to this because no one picked the option where they just wore their regular shoes inside. And I was raised like that. Like everybody just wore their regular shoes inside and outside. So in both. So I don't really do that anymore, but mostly because I work from home and I prefer to be barefooted. So I'm barefooted now. I'm barefooted most of the time when I am at home. And even when I get back to the hotel after teaching a class or something, the first thing I do is take my shoes and socks off and I'm barefooted again. So and I don't really know that I do that for like cleanliness factors or anything. I just would prefer to be barefooted.
Yeah. Well, Mary agrees with you on that aspect, Dan, as she says, quote, much to the chagrin of my husband, I am almost always barefoot, but when I do wear something, it is a pair of flip-flops I bought from a friend of mine who owns an orthopedic shoes store. They are rubber and have support, so they kind of massage my feet while I'm walking around. They are great after a long day, end quote. JGP adds, quote, it's very dependent on the time of year for me. Where I live, temps outside can range ridiculously, so in winter it's slippers and socks, spring and fall it's just socks, and in summer we go barefoot, end quote. I'm thinking on, and this makes sense to me, that one does. Like, it's kind of based on the weather and whatever. I'm thinking on the other thing just generally, it depends on floors too, right? Like,
Mm.
I didn't think about that in my answer before, but that's because where like my house currently has carpets everywhere, so I don't like except for like the kitchen and
So a
stuff.
little outdated, but yeah.
Yeah, a little bit old. I actually prefer hardwood floors, but if I had hardwood floors, it would be socks all the time, probably. Because
Really?
my feet get cold.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I've heard some people say like they think it's actually kind of gross for people to walk around without socks, like to walk around barefoot.
All right. All right. Well, that's about as much talk of shoes as I can handle.
Well, as a reminder, our silly polls mean absolutely nothing and are not scientifically valid, and patrons of all levels, including our free tiers, can take part. Head over to patreon.com/bunnytrailspod to take this week's poll. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week. Until then, remember,
Words belong to their users.